The cashier's sympathetic smile made my stomach clench as she handed me back the declined credit card. "I'm sorry, honey, but this one's not going through either. Do you have another form of payment?" Behind me, a line of customers shifted impatiently while I fumbled through my wallet, knowing I only had $12 in cash. The prescription for my daughter Emma's asthma medication sat on the counter between us, a cruel reminder that I couldn't even afford the basic necessities my family needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This was 3 weeks after my sister Victoria's wedding, an event that had cost our parents $500,000 and dominated every family conversation for 18 months. The same parents who had handed me a crumpled $20 bill for my 32nd birthday 2 months earlier, with a casual, "Sorry, sweetie, money's tight this year." What they didn't know was that I wasn't just their overlooked daughter struggling to pay for medication. I was about to become the only thing standing between our family and complete financial ruin. The humiliation at the pharmacy was just the latest in a lifetime of being treated as the afterthought in the Richardson family hierarchy. While Victoria received designer clothes, luxury cars, and unlimited financial support for every whim, I had learned to survive on hand-me-downs and part-time jobs since I was 14. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was a deliberate, systematic devaluation of my worth that had shaped every aspect of my relationship with my parents. My name is Maya Richardson-Chen, and for 32 years, I had accepted my role as the family disappointment. The daughter who chose teaching over business, who married David Chen, a kind but struggling artist instead of the Wall Street executives my parents preferred, who lived in a modest apartment in Queens instead of the Manhattan penthouse they thought I deserved. What my family never understood was that every choice I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, had been building toward something they couldn't imagine. Growing up in the Richardson household meant understanding your place in an unspoken but rigid hierarchy. My father, Robert Richardson, had built Richardson Development Group from a single apartment building into one of New York's most successful real estate empires. My mother, Patricia, had transformed herself from a middle-class teacher into Manhattan society royalty through careful cultivation of the right relationships and relentless attention to social status. Together, they had created a family culture where worth was measured by financial success, social connections, and adherence to their vision of what success looked like. Victoria, 18 months younger than me but light years ahead in parental approval, had mastered this system from childhood. She chose Yale over the full scholarship I'd earned at Columbia because Yale carried more prestige. She studied finance because it impressed our father, even though she had no genuine interest in business. She dated men based on their family connections rather than compatibility, treating relationships like strategic business partnerships designed to advance her social position. I had tried to play by their rules initially. During high school, I maintained a perfect GPA while working 20 hours a week at a local bookstore to pay for the college applications my parents claimed were too expensive. When I earned the Columbia scholarship, I thought finally they would see my worth. Instead, my father complained that I was wasting my potential on education instead of something practical like business school. The criticism intensified when I chose teaching as my career. "Maya, you're throwing away every advantage we've given you," my mother said during one particularly painful family dinner. "Teaching is noble, but it's not a career for someone with your potential. Victoria understands the importance of building wealth and status. Why can't you be more like your sister?" More like Victoria meant prioritizing money over passion, status over authenticity, family approval over personal fulfillment. It meant accepting that love in the Richardson family was conditional, earned through achievement rather than freely given. For years I had tried to bridge this gap, hoping that exceptional performance in my chosen field would eventually win the respect that seemed to come so easily to Victoria. The wedding planning process had been the most brutal demonstration of our family's value system I'd ever experienced. For 18 months, every family conversation centered on Victoria's upcoming marriage to Marcus Whitman, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and exactly the kind of son-in-law my parents had always dreamed of. The engagement had been announced at a party that cost more than I made in 6 months, complete with imported champagne and a string quartet performing in my parents' Hamptons estate. Planning sessions became family events where my input was neither requested nor valued. When I suggested cost-saving measures or more modest alternatives, my mother would smile tightly and explain that This is Victoria's special day, and we want everything to be perfect. Perfect, apparently, meant a guest list of 800 people, most of whom Victoria barely knew, imported flowers from 3 different countries, and a reception venue that required a 2-year waiting list and a 6-figure deposit. The dress shopping expeditions were particularly painful. Victoria would spend entire Saturdays trying on gowns that cost more than I made in a month, while my mother and her society friends offered commentary on each option. When I attended these sessions, I was relegated to holding purses and taking photos, treated more like hired help than family. The final dress selection cost $42,000, more than I'd spent on my entire wedding 5 years earlier. Meanwhile, my own life events were treated as minor inconveniences that interrupted the important business of wedding planning. When Emma was hospitalized with pneumonia during the height of venue selection season, my mother's primary concern was whether I'd be available for the cake tasting the following weekend. When David's art received recognition in a prestigious gallery show, the family dinner conversation focused on whether the positive publicity would interfere with wedding photography schedules. The financial disparity became impossible to ignore as wedding expenses mounted. My parents casually mentioned spending amounts that would have solved every financial stress in my life, treating these expenditures as necessary investments in Victoria's happiness. A rehearsal dinner that cost more than my annual rent, wedding favors that individually cost more than my monthly grocery budget, transportation arrangements that exceeded what I spent on my car payment for an entire year. When I had gently suggested that perhaps some of the wedding budget could be redirected toward family financial security, given that David and I were struggling with medical bills and student loans, my father had looked at me with genuine confusion. Maya, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Victoria deserves to have the wedding of her dreams. You and David will figure out your finances eventually. Eventually. As if our current struggles were temporary inconveniences, rather than the result of systematic exclusion from family financial support that had been available to Victoria since childhood. The message was clear. Victoria's happiness was worth unlimited investment, while my family's basic needs were problems I should solve independently. The birthday incident had crystallized everything I'd spent years trying to rationalize. 2 months before Victoria's wedding, during the peak of planning intensity, my 32nd birthday had fallen on a Sunday when the family was scheduled to review catering options. I had hoped for a quiet celebration, maybe dinner with David and Emma, but my mother had insisted the birthday be.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Acknowledged during the family meeting. The acknowledgement consisted of a hastily wrapped $20 bill in a Target gift bag, presented between discussions of whether the seafood station should feature lobster or crab. "Happy birthday, sweetie," my mother had said, already turning back to the catering brochures. "Sorry money's tight this year, but you understand how expensive everything is right now." Tight. While they were simultaneously discussing a $10,000 floral budget for a single evening's decoration. The irony was so profound that I had sat in stunned silence, the $20 bill feeling like a deliberate insult rather than a gift. Victoria, perhaps sensing the awkwardness, had offered to take me shopping for something nice, which somehow made the gesture feel even more patronizing. That evening, David had found me crying in our tiny kitchen, the crumpled 20 still clutched in my hand. "Maya, you know this isn't about the money," he'd said, wrapping his arms around me. "This is about respect, about being valued. And someday, they're going to realize what they've been taking for granted." His words had been comforting, but I'd wondered if that day would ever come. The Richardson family had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of overlooking my contributions, while amplifying Victoria's achievements. Change seemed not just unlikely, but impossible given how entrenched their perspective had become. The wedding itself had been exactly as extravagant as promised. 800 guests at the Plaza Hotel, with ceremonies that lasted from noon until midnight. Victoria had looked radiant in her $42,000 dress, every detail executed flawlessly according to my mother's vision of social perfection. The cost breakdown, which my father had proudly shared with anyone who would listen, included $50,000 for flowers, $30,000 for photography, $25,000 for music, and numbers that made my head spin. I had attended as the dutiful sister, wearing a dress I'd found on sale 3 months earlier and altered myself to fit properly. Emma had served as a flower girl, thrilled to be included despite being relegated to the children's table during dinner. David had taken photographs throughout the reception, his artist's eye capturing moments of genuine joy amid the orchestrated perfection. But watching Victoria and Marcus exchange vows worth more than most people's annual salaries, I had felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with envy. This wasn't just about money. It was about a family that had lost the ability to value anything that couldn't be measured in dollars or social status. A family that had forgotten that love, support, and respect were gifts that couldn't be purchased. The weeks following the wedding had brought financial reality crashing back into focus. David's art sales had slowed during the summer months, my teaching salary was stretched beyond breaking point, and Emma's medical expenses from a recent asthma flare-up had depleted our small emergency fund. When the pharmacy declined my credit card, I had reached the lowest point in a lifetime of financial struggle made worse by family indifference. What my family didn't know was that their financial situation was about to become far more precarious than mine had ever been. Robert Richardson had built his empire on aggressive expansion and leveraged investments that looked brilliant during good times but became catastrophic when markets shifted. The wedding expenses had come at precisely the wrong moment, draining liquid assets just as several major deals were beginning to unravel. Patricia's social climbing had created its own financial pressures, with lifestyle expenses that required constant cash flow to maintain. The Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, the cars, the club memberships, the charitable donations that maintained their social standing. All of it required the kind of steady income that was about to disappear as Robert's business faced its biggest crisis in 25 years. Victoria and Marcus, despite their combined family wealth, had their own vulnerabilities. Marcus's trust fund was structured to provide steady income but limited access to principal, while Victoria had never developed the financial literacy to manage significant assets independently. Their lifestyle, calibrated to match their parents' expectations, required ongoing financial support that might not be available much longer. The irony was that while they had all dismissed my modest lifestyle and careful financial management as evidence of failure, I had been quietly building something they had never bothered to understand. My teaching career, which they viewed as a waste of my potential, had provided steady income and excellent benefits during uncertain times. My marriage to David, which they had criticized as beneath my social status, had brought me into partnership with someone whose artistic vision was beginning to generate significant returns. Most importantly, my grandmother Chen's inheritance, which my family had barely acknowledged when she passed away 5 years earlier, had been carefully invested, according to principles they had never thought to ask about. The modest sum that had seemed insignificant compared to Richardson family wealth had grown steadily, while my parents and Victoria focused on spending rather than building. But the real surprise, the hidden asset that would soon transform our family dynamics completely, was something none of them knew existed. Something that would make their wedding expenses seem trivial and their financial crisis manageable, if they could overcome their pride long enough to accept help from the daughter they had spent 32 years undervaluing. The phone call that would change everything came on a Thursday evening in September, 3 weeks after the pharmacy incident and 2 months after Victoria's wedding. I was grading papers at our kitchen table while David painted in the converted bedroom that served as his studio, and Emma practiced piano in the living room. The domestic tranquility of our small apartment felt precious after the chaos and expense of wedding season. When my phone rang, displaying my father's number, I almost didn't answer. Robert Richardson called me perhaps twice a year, usually when he needed something practical like my teacher's schedule for family planning purposes. His voice, when I did pick up, carried a tension I'd never heard before. "Maya, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come to the house this weekend? There's a family situation that requires discussion." The formal language was typical of my father, but the undertone of genuine worry was completely foreign. In 32 years, I had never heard Robert Richardson sound uncertain about anything. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, immediately thinking of health crises or accidents. "Is Mom all right, Victoria?" "Everyone's fine physically," he replied carefully, "but we're facing some business challenges that might affect the family's financial situation. I'd rather discuss it in person, with everyone present." Business challenges. Coming from a man who had spent my entire lifetime projecting absolute confidence about his financial acumen, the phrase carried ominous implications. Robert Richardson didn't admit to challenges, he boasted about opportunities. He didn't call family meetings about money unless the situation was dire. Of course, I said, despite the twisted satisfaction I felt at being included in important family business for the first time in my adult life. David and Emma can come too, right? If this affects family finances, it affects all of us. There was a pause before my father agreed, another sign that this conversation was unlike any we'd had before. Robert Richardson typically made unilateral decisions and announced them to the family rather than requesting input or acknowledging other perspectives. The fact that he was asking for a meeting, rather than simply issuing instructions, suggested a level of desperation that made me genuinely concerned despite years of family resentment. Saturday afternoon found us gathered in the formal living room of my parents' Upper East Side penthouse, a space I'd always found intimidating with its museum-quality art and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria and Marcus sat on the ivory silk sofa. Victoria's designer outfit perfectly coordinated as always. Marcus checking his phone periodically with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. David and I occupied the antique chairs across from them, Emma coloring quietly in a corner with books I'd brought to keep her occupied. The contrast between our modest, practical clothing and the luxuries surrounding us had never felt more pronounced, but for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of the difference. Instead, I felt curious about why we were all here. My mother entered carrying a silver tea service, her movements precise and controlled in the way that indicated extreme stress beneath a carefully maintained surface. Patricia Richardson had built her identity around being the perfect hostess, the woman who made everything look effortless even when circumstances were chaotic. Seeing her hands shake slightly as she poured tea told me more about the severity of this situation than any words could have. My father followed, carrying a leather portfolio that he placed on the coffee table with unusual ceremony. Robert Richardson was a man who commanded rooms through presence alone, but today he seemed diminished, older, uncertain in ways that were profoundly unsettling to witness. I've asked you all here because our family is facing a financial crisis that will require difficult decisions and possibly significant lifestyle changes, he began without preamble. Richardson Development Group is experiencing serious cash flow problems that threaten the viability of the entire company. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria's face went pale, while Marcus looked up from his phone with sharp attention. David reached over to squeeze my hand, understanding that whatever was coming would affect all of us, while Emma continued coloring, oblivious to the adult tension surrounding her. "What kind of cash flow problems?" Victoria asked, her voice smaller than usual. "I thought the business was doing well. You just expanded into 3 new markets last year." "The expansion was the problem," my father admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I leveraged our existing properties to finance new acquisitions, betting that the market would continue growing at the same rate. When interest rates shifted and several major tenants defaulted on their leases simultaneously, we found ourselves overextended with limited liquid assets to cover our obligations." The business explanation was classic Robert Richardson, focused on external factors rather than acknowledging decision-making errors. But the underlying message was clear. The empire he'd spent decades building was crumbling, and the family's lifestyle was about to change dramatically. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would be worse than anyone was prepared to hear. My father opened his portfolio and extracted a document that he placed on the table where we could all see it. "We have 60 days to secure $8 million in liquid capital, or we'll lose everything. The Hamptons house, this apartment, the business assets, the investment accounts. All of it will go to creditors. $8 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible to ignore or minimize. Victoria's wedding had cost $500,000 and had required 18 months of planning and financial preparation. $8 million was a different order of magnitude entirely, the kind of money that represented generational wealth rather than annual income. "What about emergency loans?" Marcus asked, his business school training evident in his attempt to find practical solutions. "Bridge financing until the market recovers? There have to be options for a company with Richardson Development's track record." "I've exhausted those possibilities," my father replied with the flat tone of someone who had already explored every avenue he could think of. "The Same market conditions that created our cash flow crisis have made lenders extremely conservative. No one wants to extend credit to real estate companies right now, regardless of their historical performance. Patricia finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of panic. Robert, surely there are assets we can liquidate. Art, jewelry, something that could bridge the gap until business conditions improve. We've already liquidated everything liquid, he said quietly. The art collection went last month. Your jewelry went the week before Victoria's wedding. We've been selling assets for 6 months just to cover basic operating expenses and wedding costs. Wedding costs. The phrase seemed to echo in the room, a reminder that $500,000 had been spent on a single day's celebration while the family foundation crumbled beneath them. Victoria's face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing that his new wife's family was less financially stable than he'd assumed. What about loans from friends? Victoria suggested desperately. The Whitmans, the Ashfords, people who've known our family for years. They wouldn't let us lose everything. Victoria, my mother said gently, those relationships were built on social reciprocity. We maintained friendships through entertainment, charity donations, and social events that we can no longer afford. People who seemed like close friends when we could contribute to their fundraisers become remarkably unavailable when you need financial help. The harsh reality of their social circle was something I'd observed from the periphery for years. The Richardson family's relationships were transactional, based on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. When the benefits disappeared, so would the relationships, leaving them isolated precisely when they needed support most. There has to be something, Victoria insisted, her voice rising with panic. We can't just lose everything. What about Marcus's family? Could they help temporarily? Marcus's expression tightened, revealing the limits of his willingness to support his new wife's family crisis. The Whitman family trusts are structured to prevent exactly this kind of situation. I don't have access to capital on that scale, and the trustees wouldn't approve emergency distributions for non-Whitman family obligations. The careful legal language couldn't disguise the basic message. Marcus and his family had protected their wealth specifically to avoid being pulled into other people's financial disasters. Victoria's marriage, which had seemed like a perfect solution to family financial security, provided social status, but no actual financial protection when crisis struck. As I listened to my family discuss their desperate situation, I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. Sympathy for their genuine distress, anger at the years of dismissal and exclusion that had led to this moment, and something that might have been relief that their financial superiority had revealed itself to be an illusion built on unsustainable spending and poor planning. But beneath those emotions was something more important. The recognition that despite everything they had put me through, I was not willing to watch my family lose everything when I had the power to help them. Not because they deserved my assistance, but because I was a better person than their treatment of me had encouraged me to become. The revelation I was about to share would transform our family dynamics forever, forcing them to confront not just their current crisis, but their fundamental assumptions about success, worth, and the daughter they had consistently undervalued. What they were about to learn would challenge everything they thought they knew about money, wisdom, and the quiet strength that grows in shadows while others chase spotlights. The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through increasingly desperate suggestions and the painful realization that traditional solutions were not available to them. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the expensive furniture that would soon belong to creditors, my family faced the collapse of everything they had built their identities around. And I sat quietly, knowing that I held the key to their salvation, waiting for the right moment to reveal that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had become their only hope for survival. The silence stretched uncomfortably as my family processed the magnitude of their financial collapse. $8 million in 60 days seemed impossible, especially given that they had already liquidated everything they thought had value. What they didn't understand was that while they had been focused on maintaining appearances and funding extravagant celebrations, I had been quietly building something far more substantial than any of them realized. My grandmother Chen had died 5 years earlier, leaving me what my family had dismissively referred to as, quote, a small inheritance from David's side. They had never bothered to ask about the specifics, assuming that anything coming from a working-class immigrant family would be modest and insignificant compared to Richardson wealth. Their casual indifference to my grandmother's legacy had been typical of their attitude toward anything connected to my chosen life rather than their approved version of success. What they didn't know was that Grandmother Chen had been far more than the sweet elderly woman who made dumplings for family gatherings. She had arrived in America with nothing in 1952, worked 16-hour days in garment factories while learning English at night, and eventually built a small but incredibly successful import business that specialized in high-quality textiles and artwork. By the time she passed away, her quiet empire was worth considerably more than the Richardson family had ever imagined possible. The inheritance had come with specific instructions that revealed the depth of my grandmother's wisdom about money, family, and the importance of building wealth that couldn't be destroyed by market fluctuations or poor decisions. Her letter, written in careful English that still carried traces of her Chinese heritage, had outlined a financial philosophy that prioritized long-term security over immediate gratification. Maya, she had written, I leave you not just money, but the responsibility to use it wisely. I have watched your family dismiss you because you choose teaching over business, because you marry for love instead of status, because you value substance over appearance. They do not understand that true wealth comes from patience, wisdom, and the ability to see value where others see only modest success. The inheritance itself had been structured in ways that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of both American financial systems and human nature. Rather than a lump sum that could be quickly spent or poorly invested, she had created a trust that provided steady income while protecting the principal through diversified investments in technology companies, international markets, and real estate ventures that the Richardson family's traditional approach would never have considered. More importantly, she had included provisions that allowed me to access larger amounts of capital for specific purposes: education, medical emergencies, business investments, or family crises that required immediate response. The language of the trust had been carefully crafted to give me maximum flexibility while ensuring that the wealth would continue growing for future generations. During the 5 years since her death, I had followed her investment philosophy religiously. Instead of using the inheritance to upgrade our lifestyle or compete with my family's spending habits, David and I had maintained our modest apartment, continued working in our chosen careers, and allowed the trust to grow while we learned to manage significant assets responsibly. The results had exceeded even my grandmother's optimistic projections. Technology investments she had identified in her final years had multiplied in value as companies like Tesla, Amazon, and various startup ventures transformed entire industries. International real estate purchases in emerging markets had appreciated dramatically as global development patterns shifted. Most surprisingly, her art collection, which she had quietly assembled over decades, had become extraordinarily valuable as Asian artists gained recognition in international markets. What my family assumed was a modest teaching salary, supplemented by David's inconsistent art sales, was actually a comfortable income that we chose to live on, while our real wealth accumulated quietly in accounts they knew nothing about. The financial stress they had observed during Emma's medical emergencies had been real, but temporary, the result of my decision to handle routine expenses through our regular income, rather than accessing trust funds unnecessarily. By the time Victoria's wedding planning began, the trust was worth just over $12 million, with liquid assets available for immediate use exceeding the amount my family now desperately needed. The irony was profound. While they had been spending inherited wealth on maintaining appearances, I had been growing inherited wealth through patience and strategic planning. But the money was only part of what my grandmother had left me. Her business philosophy, learned through decades of navigating American markets as an immigrant woman, had taught me to recognize opportunities that others overlooked, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than social hierarchy. These lessons had guided every major decision David and I had made, from our choice of neighborhood, to our approach to Emma's education, to the way we handled extended family dynamics. The art world connections that came through David's career had opened doors to investment opportunities and cultural projects that traditional Richardson family networks would never have accessed. Teaching had provided not just steady income and excellent benefits, but also connections to diverse communities and perspectives that enriched our understanding of how wealth could be used responsibly. Most importantly, our modest lifestyle had taught us the difference between having money and needing to spend money to prove you had it. While my family's identity was built around visible displays of wealth that required constant cash flow to maintain, David and I had learned to find satisfaction in experiences and relationships that couldn't be repossessed during market downturns. The 60-day deadline my father had announced was real, but not insurmountable. What made this situation particularly interesting was that I had been quietly monitoring Richardson Development Group's financial health for months. Not out of family loyalty, but because their real estate holdings intersected with some of my trust's investment strategies. My grandmother's portfolio included commercial real estate in several markets where Richardson Development operated, and the quarterly reports I received had highlighted concerning trends in their sector long before my father's crisis meeting. Aggressive expansion, over-leveraging, dependence on favorable interest rates, and lack of diversification had created exactly the kind of vulnerability that experienced investors learned to avoid. More telling was my research into the family's personal finances, which I had investigated not from nosiness but from genuine concern about their long-term stability. The wedding expenses had been funded through liquidating assets and taking on debt at precisely the wrong time, creating cash flow problems that even modest market fluctuations could transform into genuine crisis. What I had discovered was a family living paycheck to paycheck despite having significant assets, a situation that my grandmother would have recognized immediately as the result of confusing wealth with income. The Richardson family had wealth in the form of real estate and investments, but they had structured their lives to require constant liquidity to maintain their lifestyle. The solution to their immediate crisis was actually straightforward from a financial perspective, though it would require them to accept help from someone they had consistently undervalued, and to acknowledge that their approach to money management had been fundamentally flawed. During the emergency family meeting, as I listened to increasingly desperate suggestions and watched my parents' growing panic, I found myself calculating not just whether I could help them, but whether helping them would actually serve their long-term interests. Providing $8 million to solve their immediate crisis would be meaningless if they simply resumed the spending patterns that had created the problem. The real question was whether this crisis represented an opportunity for them to learn different values about money, family, and success, or whether they would view any assistance as validation of their existing approach to wealth management. My grandmother's philosophy emphasized that money should be used to teach wisdom, not to enable continued poor decision-making. As the sun set and the family meeting continued with no viable solutions emerging, I began formulating a plan that would address not just their immediate financial needs but also the deeper issues that had created this crisis. The assistance I could provide would come with conditions designed to ensure that this catastrophe became a learning experience, rather than just a temporary setback. The first step would be forcing them to acknowledge the true scope of their financial mismanagement and the systematic changes that would be required to rebuild sustainable wealth. The second step would be establishing my role not as a desperate last resort, but as an equal partner in family financial planning whose perspective had value independent of emergency circumstances. Most importantly, I needed to ensure that any help I provided would strengthen rather than undermine the values David and I were teaching Emma about money, responsibility, and family relationships. She was watching this crisis unfold, and the lessons she learned from how we handled it would shape her understanding of wealth and family loyalty for the rest of her life. The conversation was winding down with no solutions identified when Victoria finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air since my father's announcement. What happens if we can't find the money? What exactly do we lose, and what options do we have for starting over? My father's response was devastatingly comprehensive. The business would be liquidated to satisfy creditors, with any remaining debt becoming personal liability that would follow them indefinitely. The Manhattan penthouse would be sold to satisfy the mortgage and business guarantees he had personally signed. The Hamptons estate would go to the bank that had financed the expansion project. Investment accounts would be frozen and ultimately distributed to creditors based on priority claims that left the family with virtually nothing. We'd be starting completely over, he admitted quietly. probably renting a modest apartment somewhere, looking for employment after 25 years of running my own company. At my age, with the financial failure on my record, finding comparable work would be extremely difficult. Patricia's composure finally cracked as the reality of potential poverty settled over her. Robert, we can't go from this to nothing. The social implications alone would be devastating. Our friends, our standing in the community, Emma's education, Victoria's marriage prospects if Marcus decides we're a liability rather than an asset. The mention of Emma's education caught my attention immediately. My daughter attended an excellent public school in Queens, where she was thriving academically and socially, in an environment that valued diversity and intellectual curiosity over social status. The idea that her education would suffer if my parents lost their wealth revealed how little they understood about what actually contributed to educational quality. But Patricia's fear about social standing exposed the deeper issue underlying their financial crisis. They had built their entire identity around being wealthy, rather than around creating value, maintaining relationships, or developing skills that would remain useful during difficult times. When their wealth disappeared, they would have nothing left to build on, because they had never learned to define success in terms that didn't require constant spending to maintain. Marcus, perhaps sensing that his association with a bankrupt family could damage his own social position, began subtly distancing himself from the conversation. Obviously, Victoria and I will do whatever we can to help, within our means. But my financial obligations to my own family have to take priority, and there are legal restrictions on how trust fund assets can be used. Victoria's face showed the realization that her marriage, which had seemed like financial security, was actually conditional on her family maintaining their social status. The man she had married for his wealth and connections was already protecting himself against the possibility that association with the Richardson family might become a liability. There has to be someone who could help, Victoria insisted desperately. What about Uncle James, Cousin Richard, the Ashford family? We've been friends for decades. Victoria, my mother said sadly, those relationships were built on reciprocity. We maintained them through entertaining, charitable donations, and social events that cost money we no longer have. When people realize we're not just temporarily embarrassed but actually broke, most of those friendships will disappear rather than risk becoming obligations. The harsh lesson about fair-weather friends was one that wealthy families often learned too late. The social circle that seemed so solid during prosperous times evaporated quickly when the entertainment budget disappeared and friendship became charity rather than mutual benefit. As I watched my family confront the collapse of everything they had built their lives around, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sympathy for their genuine distress, frustration with the poor decisions that had created this crisis, anger about years of dismissive treatment, but also recognition that this moment represented an opportunity for all of us to build more authentic relationships based on shared values, rather than financial hierarchy. The conversation eventually ended with my father promising to continue exploring options, while preparing for the possibility that no solution would emerge. Family members dispersed with uncomfortable hugs and promises to stay in touch regardless of what happened, though everyone understood that their relationships would be fundamentally different if the financial foundation disappeared. David, Emma, and I took the subway back to Queens in unusual silence, each of us processing what we had witnessed and what it might mean for our family's future. Emma, who had absorbed more of the adult conversation than anyone realized, finally asked the question that went to the heart of the evening's revelations. Mama, are Grandma and Grandpa really gonna lose their house? And does that mean we won't see them anymore because they'll be embarrassed about being poor like us? Her innocent question captured the tragedy of the Richardson family's situation more clearly than any financial analysis could have. They had spent so much energy maintaining the appearance of superiority that they had taught their granddaughter to view her own family as poor, rather than recognizing the wealth of love, stability, and authentic relationships that David and I had built together. Emma, I said carefully, Grandma and Grandpa are facing some difficult times, but that doesn't make them bad people or mean we love them any less. Sometimes when people have been wealthy for a long time, they forget that there are many different ways to be successful and happy. Maybe this will help them remember what's really important in life. David squeezed my hand, understanding that I was talking about more than just my parents. Financial crisis. The foundation we had built for our own family, based on my grandmother's wisdom about money and values, had prepared us not just to weather difficult times, but to help others learn from their mistakes without judgment or superiority. That night, after Emma was asleep and David was working in his studio, I sat at our kitchen table with my grandmother's letters and trust documents, planning how to approach my family with an offer that could save them from financial ruin while teaching them the lessons they needed to learn about sustainable wealth and authentic relationships. The assistance I could provide would come with conditions that ensured this crisis became a learning experience, rather than just a bailout that enabled continued poor decision-making. They would need to acknowledge their mistakes, accept guidance about financial management, and fundamentally change their approach to money and family relationships. Most importantly, they would need to recognize that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had become their salvation not through luck or inheritance, but through patience, wisdom, and the values they had never bothered to understand. The revealing of my financial capability would force them to confront not just their current crisis, but their fundamental assumptions about success, worth, and the family member they had consistently undervalued. The phone call I planned to make the following morning would transform our family dynamics forever, offering them not just financial rescue but the opportunity to build more authentic relationships based on mutual respect, rather than economic hierarchy. Whether they could overcome their pride long enough to accept both the help and the lessons that came with it would determine not just their financial future, but the kind of family Emma would grow up understanding herself to be part of. 3 days after the family meeting, I called my father and asked to meet privately before approaching the situation as a group. The conversation I had in mind required careful preparation and a clear understanding of what I was and wasn't willing to do to help them through this crisis. We met at a small coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory where my father couldn't rely on the authority that came from receiving people in his expensive office or elegant home. Robert Richardson looked older than I had ever seen him, his usual confidence replaced by the haunted expression of someone facing the collapse of everything he had built his identity around. "Maya, I'm glad you called," he said, settling into the booth across from me with obvious fatigue. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, and I wanted to apologize for the way our family has handled financial discussions over the years. It occurs to me that we've never really asked about your situation or whether there were ways we could have been more supportive." The apology was carefully worded and long overdue, but it also revealed how little he understood about the dynamics that had shaped our relationship. He was apologizing for not being supportive, when the real issue was that he had never seen me as someone whose perspective had value or whose success was worth acknowledging. "Dad," I said gently, "I appreciate that, but the issue isn't just about money. For 32 years, you and Mom have treated me like my choices were evidence of failure rather than different values. You've dismissed my career, my marriage, my lifestyle, and my opinions because they didn't match your definition of success. The financial crisis you're facing now is serious, but it's also an opportunity to reconsider those definitions." He listened with the careful attention of someone who had no choice but to hear perspectives he had previously ignored. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the wealth you've lost was never as secure as you believed it to be, because it was built on assumptions about markets, interest rates, and spending patterns that turned out to be wrong. The modest lifestyle you've criticized me for choosing has actually provided more financial security than your approach to wealth management." My father's expression shifted from confusion to sharp attention. "Maya, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that while you were spending inherited wealth to maintain appearances, I was growing inherited wealth through patience and strategic planning. The crisis you're facing is real, but it's not insurmountable. The question is whether you're willing to accept help that comes with conditions designed to ensure this doesn't happen again." The silence that followed was profound, as Robert Richardson processed the implication that his supposedly unsuccessful daughter might be in a position to solve a problem that had defeated all his business experience and social connections. "How much help are we talking about?" he asked quietly. "All of it," I replied simply. "I can provide the $8 million you need to save the business and keep the family assets. But the assistance comes with requirements that will fundamentally change how you approach money, family decisions, and the values you use to measure success." The shock on his face was complete. In 67 years of life and 40 years of business success, Robert Richardson had never encountered a situation where his least successful child was offering to solve a problem that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Maya, I don't understand. How is that possible? Where would you get that kind of money? From the grandmother you barely acknowledged when she died, managed according to principles you never bothered to learn about, invested in opportunities you would have dismissed as beneath your attention. My voice carried no anger, just the quiet satisfaction of finally being able to share information I had kept private for 5 years. Grandmother Chen was worth $12 million when she died. She left most of it to me, not because she didn't like the rest of the family, but because she believed I understood the difference between having money and being defined by money. The inheritance has grown to just over $12 million through investments in technology, international markets, and art that followed her philosophy rather than traditional wealth management approaches. My father stared at me as if I had revealed myself to be a completely different person than he had known for 3 decades. $12 million. You've had $12 million, and you've been living in a tiny apartment in Queens, working as a teacher, struggling to pay for Emma's medical bills. I haven't been struggling, Dad. I've been choosing to live modestly while building wealth responsibly. The medical bills were paid from our regular income because I wanted to reserve trust funds for genuine emergencies or opportunities to make a meaningful difference. This situation qualifies on both counts. The conversation continued for 2 hours as I explained the conditions that would accompany any financial assistance. They would need to downsize their lifestyle to sustainable levels, accept my involvement in major financial decisions, acknowledge the mistakes that had created this crisis, and fundamentally change their approach to family relationships. Most importantly, they would need to recognize that my success in managing wealth contradicted everything they had assumed about the relationship between lifestyle, career choices, and financial wisdom. The daughter they had dismissed as a failure had become their salvation through exactly the values they had criticized. When we finally parted that afternoon, my father had agreed to call a family meeting where I would present my offer formally. The transformation in his demeanor was striking. The condescending authority that had characterized his interactions with me for 32 years had been replaced by genuine respect, and something that might have been gratitude. The family meeting I called for the following weekend would reveal not just my financial capability, but the depth of planning and wisdom that had made that capability possible. The Richardson family was about to learn that true wealth comes not from spending money to impress others, but from building resources that provide genuine security and the freedom to help others when crisis strikes. The reckoning that was coming would force them to confront not just their current financial emergency, but their fundamental assumptions about success, worth, and the family member who had quietly become everything they had never understood they needed. The second family meeting convened on Sunday morning in the same formal living room where the crisis had been announced, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where desperation and panic had dominated the previous gathering, an electric tension now filled the air as family members sensed that something significant was about to unfold, though none of them except my father understood the true nature of what I was prepared to reveal. Victoria arrived early, her usual designer perfection slightly frayed around the edges. The stress of potential financial ruin had begun showing in small ways. Her manicure was chipped, her handbag was last season rather than cutting edge, and her conversation lacked the confident authority that had always characterized her interactions with family members. Marcus accompanied her, but his body language suggested a man preparing to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. My mother had prepared the formal tea service again, but her movements were more controlled, less shaky than the previous week. Perhaps having a specific meeting to attend with potential solutions had provided some relief from the free-floating anxiety that had consumed her since learning the scope of their financial collapse. David, Emma, and I arrived precisely on time, carrying the leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandmother, along with documents I had prepared throughout the week. Emma settled into her corner with coloring books, unaware that the conversation about to unfold would fundamentally alter her understanding of her family's place in the world. I waited until everyone was seated and had accepted tea before standing and moving to the position at the head of the room that my father typically occupied during family discussions. The symbolic shift wasn't lost on anyone present, though its full significance wouldn't become clear until the conversation concluded. Last week, Dad outlined a financial crisis that threatens everything our family has built over 3 generations. I began, my voice carrying the calm authority I had learned from years of managing significant assets without fanfare. $8 million in 60 days to save Richardson Development Group and preserve family assets that represent not just money, but security for all of us. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that the sister she had consistently dismissed was about to reveal information that would change their relationship forever. Marcus checked his phone, a nervous habit that suggested he was preparing exit strategies rather than focusing on potential solutions. The traditional options have been exhausted, I continued. Banks won't extend credit, business assets can't be liquidated quickly enough, social connections have proven unreliable when actual financial need replaces reciprocal entertainment. The family faces bankruptcy, asset forfeiture, and starting completely over at ages when rebuilding becomes exponentially more difficult. My father nodded gravely, acknowledging the accuracy of my assessment. My mother's hands remained steady on her teacup, but her eyes never left my face, as if she was beginning to suspect that this conversation would reveal aspects of my life that she had never bothered to investigate. However, I said, opening my grandmother's portfolio, there is one option that hasn't been explored. An option that requires the family to acknowledge some uncomfortable truths about money, success, and the assumptions that created this crisis. The silence in the room was complete. Even Emma had stopped coloring, sensing the adult tension that indicated something important was happening even if she couldn't understand the specifics. For 5 years since Grandmother Chen's death, I have been managing an inheritance that our family never bothered to investigate because it came from David's working-class immigrant family, rather than the Richardson social circle. The assumption was that anything from that source would be modest and irrelevant compared to established wealth. Victoria's face showed the first flicker of genuine attention she had given me during a family meeting in years. Maya, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the systematic dismissal of anything connected to my chosen life rather than your approved version of success, I replied calmly. Grandmother Chen was worth $12 million when she died. She left most of it to me, not out of favoritism, but because she believed I understood the difference between having money and being controlled by money. The shock was immediate and profound. Victoria's mouth actually fell open, while Marcus looked up from his phone with sharp attention for the first time since arriving. My mother set down her teacup with trembling hands, and my father leaned forward despite having heard this information during our private conversation. $12 million, Victoria repeated faintly. You've had $12 million for 5 years. I've had access to $12 million, I corrected. But more importantly, I've had the wisdom to manage it according to principles that prioritize long-term security over immediate gratification. The inheritance has grown to just over $14 million through investments in technology companies, international real estate, and art markets that traditional wealth management would have overlooked. The number seemed to echo in the elegant room, dwarfing even the crisis amount that had seemed so insurmountable just moments before. $14 million represented generational wealth, the kind of financial foundation that could support multiple families through any conceivable crisis. Maya, my mother said slowly, if you've had access to that much money, why have you been living in Queens? Why have you been working as a teacher? Why did you struggle with Emma's medical bills? Because those choices reflect values, not limitations, I replied. I live in Queens because I like our community, and Emma attends an excellent school there. I work as a teacher because I find education meaningful, and it provides steady income with excellent benefits. I handled Emma's medical bills from our regular income because I wanted to reserve trust funds for genuine emergencies or opportunities to make a meaningful difference. David reached over to squeeze my hand, understanding that this revelation was as difficult for me as it was shocking for my family. We had chosen to keep our financial situation private, not out of shame, but because we had watched how money affected family relationships and wanted to avoid the complications that came with others knowing about significant wealth. This situation qualifies on both counts, I continued. A genuine emergency that threatens family stability, and an opportunity to make a meaningful difference by helping people I love despite their treatment of me over the years. Victoria found her voice, though it carried none of its usual authority. Maya, you're saying you can solve this entire crisis? You can provide the 8 million Dad needs? I can provide the 8 million, I confirmed. But the assistance comes with conditions designed to ensure that this crisis becomes a learning experience, rather than just a bailout that enables continued poor decision-making. Marcus finally spoke, his business school training evident in his attempt to find the catch in what seemed like an impossibly generous offer. What kind of conditions? First, complete transparency about how this crisis developed and acknowledgement of the specific decisions that created it, I said, pulling documents from my portfolio. Second, fundamental changes to spending patterns and lifestyle expectations to ensure sustainable wealth management going forward. Third, my involvement in major financial decisions as an equal partner rather than a last resort to be consulted only during emergencies. I placed spreadsheets on the coffee table that detailed their family's financial patterns over the past 5 years, information I had compiled through careful research and analysis that revealed the systematic problems underlying their current crisis. Most importantly, I continued, recognition that the values you've used to measure success have been fundamentally flawed. The modest lifestyle you've criticized me for choosing has provided more genuine security than your approach to wealth management. The career you've dismissed as beneath my potential has contributed more to our family's actual financial stability than years of spending inherited money to maintain appearances. The documentation I had prepared was comprehensive and devastating. 5 years of wedding planning expenses that exceeded most families' annual income. Lifestyle costs that required constant liquidity without building long-term assets. Investment decisions based on social connections rather than financial analysis. Entertainment expenses that maintained relationships but provided no return when genuine help was needed. Look at these numbers, I said, pointing to specific line items that told the story of their financial decline. $500,000 for Victoria's wedding during the same month that you were liquidating art collections to cover business operations. $40,000 annually on country club memberships that provided social access but no business advantage. $60,000 last year on luxury travel while taking loans against business assets to maintain cash flow. Victoria's face had gone pale as she recognized that her wedding, the event that had seemed like the pinnacle of family success, had actually accelerated their march toward financial ruin. You're saying my wedding caused this crisis? I'm saying your wedding was symptomatic of an approach to money that prioritizes immediate gratification over long-term security, I replied without judgment. The $500,000 spent on a single day's celebration could have provided financial stability during market fluctuations, but instead it required liquidating assets at precisely the wrong time. My father finally spoke, his voice heavy with regret. Maya, you're absolutely right. Every decision you're highlighting seemed reasonable at the time, but we never considered the cumulative effect or the risk of multiple problems occurring simultaneously. Dad, the individual decisions weren't necessarily wrong, I said more gently. The problem was making them without a comprehensive financial plan that accounted for market volatility, business risk, and the need to maintain adequate reserves for emergencies. Grandmother Chen taught me that wealth is only as secure as the systems that protect it. I opened another section of my portfolio and extracted the formal proposal I had prepared for restructuring their finances. This is what I'm prepared to offer. $8 million in immediate liquidity to resolve the current crisis, plus ongoing financial advisory services to rebuild sustainable wealth management practices. The relief on their faces was immediate and profound, but I continued before anyone could respond. The conditions are non-negotiable. First, downsizing to a lifestyle that can be maintained from business income alone, without relying on asset liquidation or excessive debt. Second, establishing emergency reserves that can handle 6 months of expenses without market exposure. Third, investment diversification that doesn't depend entirely on real estate markets. Victoria raised her hand tentatively, as if asking permission to speak in her own family's living room. Maya, what does downsizing mean specifically? Are we talking about selling the apartments? You're talking about selling one apartment and keeping the other, depending on which provides better long-term value, I replied. You're talking about realistic budgets for entertainment, travel, and discretionary spending that don't require borrowing against business assets. You're talking about making financial decisions based on mathematics rather than social expectations. Marcus leaned forward with obvious interest. What about the business itself? Richardson Development Group has good fundamentals despite the current crisis. With proper capitalization and conservative management, it could generate significant returns. Exactly, I agreed. But that requires accepting that growth should be funded from profits rather than borrowed against existing assets, and that expansion should be planned around market realities, rather than optimistic projections about continued appreciation. My mother had been unusually quiet throughout the presentation, but she finally found her voice to ask the question that went to the heart of our family dynamics. Maya, why are you willing to do this? After everything we've put you through, all the years of dismissing your choices and treating you like your success didn't matter, why would you help us? The question hung in the air with profound weight, addressing not just the immediate crisis but decades of family history that had led to this moment. David squeezed my hand again, understanding that my answer would define not just the financial arrangement but the future of our family relationships. Because I learned from Grandmother Chen that wealth is a responsibility, not just an asset, I said quietly. Because despite everything, you're my family, and I don't want Emma to grow up thinking that love is conditional on financial success. Because this crisis is an opportunity for all of us to build more authentic relationships based on shared values rather than economic hierarchy. I paused, looking around the room at faces that showed genuine remorse, desperate hope, and the beginning of real respect for perspectives they had never bothered to consider. But mostly because I believe you're capable of learning from this experience and becoming the kind of family that values substance over appearance, that measures success by security and happiness rather than spending and status, that recognizes wisdom wherever it comes from rather than dismissing it based on predetermined assumptions about who matters. Victoria was crying quietly, perhaps understanding for the first time that her relationship with money and family had been fundamentally distorted by values that prioritized competition over cooperation. Maya, I'm so sorry, we've been terrible to you, and you're saving us anyway. Victoria, you haven't been terrible, I replied gently. You've been operating according to the values you were taught about success and family hierarchy. This crisis is an opportunity for all of us to learn different values that create more security and more authentic relationships. The conversation continued for 3 hours as we worked through the specific logistics of financial restructuring, legal arrangements for transferring funds, and timeline for implementing the lifestyle changes that would ensure long-term stability. By the time we finished, the Richardson family had not just a solution to their immediate crisis, but a comprehensive plan for rebuilding wealth on a foundation that couldn't be destroyed by market fluctuations or poor decision-making. The most significant change wasn't financial, but relational. For the first time in 32 years, my family was treating me as an equal partner whose perspective had value independent of emergency circumstances. The daughter they had dismissed as a failure had become their salvation, not through luck or inheritance alone, but through patience, wisdom, and values they had never bothered to understand. 6 months later, the transformation in our family dynamics was remarkable and ongoing. Richardson Development Group had been restructured with conservative debt ratios and diversified revenue streams that could withstand market volatility. My parents had sold the Manhattan penthouse and moved to a beautiful but more modest apartment on the Upper West Side, discovering that their happiness didn't actually depend on maintaining the most expensive possible lifestyle. Victoria and Marcus had made their own adjustments, though Marcus's initial enthusiasm for the family's financial recovery had cooled considerably once he realized that my involvement meant genuine oversight of spending decisions rather than unlimited access to family wealth. Their marriage was surviving, but Victoria was learning to distinguish between relationships built on mutual respect versus those that depended on financial advantage. Most importantly, Emma was growing up in a family that valued education, creativity, and kindness over status symbols and social competition. The weekly family dinners we had established took place in different homes on a rotating basis, including our apartment in Queens, where my parents were learning to appreciate the community and values that David and I had chosen over their previous lifestyle. The financial education component of our arrangement had exceeded all expectations. My father had become genuinely interested in the investment philosophy that had grown my grandmother's legacy, while my mother was discovering satisfaction in charitable work that created meaningful impact rather than just social recognition. Victoria was taking business classes to understand money management independently, rather than relying on others to handle financial decisions. But the most profound change was in how our family defined success. Emma's achievements in school, David's growing recognition in the art world, my satisfaction as a teacher, and even my parents' increased happiness with a more sustainable lifestyle were celebrated as genuine accomplishments, rather than consolation prizes for failing to achieve wealth and status. The Richardson family had learned that true security comes not from spending money to impress others, but from building resources that provide genuine freedom and the ability to help others when needed. We had discovered that authentic relationships are based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than financial hierarchy or social advantage. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything my parents had built had actually created the foundation for something much stronger, a family that valued wisdom over wealth, that measured success by happiness and security rather than spending and status, that recognized that true prosperity comes from building something sustainable rather than just accumulating something impressive. During our most recent family dinner, held in my parents' new apartment with its stunning park views and comfortable but not ostentatious furnishings, my father had made an observation that captured the depth of our transformation. Maya, I realize now that we spent 32 years looking at your life as evidence that you couldn't achieve success, when we should have been learning from your success at achieving the kind of life that actually makes people happy. He said, watching Emma help my mother prepare dessert in the kitchen. You built something we never understood was more valuable than anything we thought we had. The family that had once measured worth by wedding expenses and birthday gift amounts had learned to value the wealth that couldn't be repossessed during market downturns. Strong relationships, financial wisdom, genuine security, and the satisfaction that comes from helping others not because you have to, but because you choose to. Victoria, who had spent years competing with me for parental approval, had become my closest friend and most trusted advisor on family matters. The sister who had received $500,000 for her wedding now understood that the $20 birthday gift had been symptomatic of a value system that confused spending with love, that mistook competition for relationship, that failed to recognize authentic success when it was happening quietly in Queens apartments and public school classrooms. The greatest gift hadn't been the financial rescue that saved Richardson Development Group, but the opportunity for all of us to learn that true wealth comes from patience, wisdom, and the values that remain strong even when market conditions change. We had discovered that the most important inheritance isn't money, but the knowledge of how to build a life that provides genuine security and authentic happiness regardless of external circumstances. As Emma finished her homework at the dinner table where 3 generations of our family now gathered weekly, I watched her absorb lessons about money, success, and family loyalty that would serve her throughout her life. She was learning that wealth is a tool for creating security and helping others, not a measure of personal worth. She was seeing that authentic relationships are built on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial advantage or social status. Most importantly, she was growing up in a family that had learned to value substance over appearance, that celebrated different forms of success, that understood the difference between having money and being controlled by money. The Richardson family had discovered that true prosperity comes not from accumulating wealth to impress others, but from building resources that provide genuine freedom and the ability to create positive impact in the world. The transformation was complete, but ongoing. Each family dinner, each financial decision, each conversation about Emma's future reinforced the values we had learned through crisis and redemption. The family that had almost been destroyed by poor financial planning had become stronger through learning that wealth without wisdom is temporary, but wisdom about wealth creates security that lasts for generations. The crisis that had threatened everything had actually saved us from a value system that was slowly destroying our relationships and our authentic happiness. We had learned that the most valuable inheritance is not money itself, but the wisdom to use money in ways that strengthen families, support communities, and create lasting positive impact rather than just impressive temporary displays. The daughter who had been dismissed as a failure had become the teacher who showed her family that true success isn't measured by how much you can spend, but by how much security, happiness, and authentic relationship you can build. The Richardson family had discovered that the greatest wealth is the kind that makes other people's lives better, starting with the people you love most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.